Good, good, good. Thank you all for being here. We're talking about writing on relationships. Today, I am here with author Ashton Lattimore. Thank you so much for being here, Ashton.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So, we'll just jump right in. I'd love for you to share with us a little bit about you and your background. Okay. Because I know, so she is not only an amazing author, she's an attorney. Tell us all the things.
Sure. So I started off as a lawyer. I started off as a journalist, actually, and then switched to law and then switched back to journalism just because I love writing. And I think the way that I found my way into fiction was as a lawyer, you end up doing quite a bit of research for the writing that you need to do for briefs. And I just discovered a love of historical research. So that's how I ended up writing historical fiction.
And how do you think that background, beyond research, how do you think that background informs your approach to storytelling?
Sure. So I think part of what we're talking about today is relationships, and so much of the law is about the breakdown of relationships. You end up in court against somebody because something has gone terribly wrong, whether it's a business relationship or a personal relationship. So just exploring the different ways that things can go right as well as go wrong between people within their relationships. I think the law informs a lot of that. And as a journalist, I just have a love of storytelling in all of its forms. So that shows up, I think, across the page in both of my books as well.
Okay. So your next book, which is out the end of this month, I believe, Runner.
Yes.
Make note of that, everyone. Is about someone who's a rum runner. And what decade was it? When was
It's
it?
in the 1920s,
During the
Prohibition era,
Yes, during the Prohibition era. Okay. And that alone resonated with me because my maternal grandfather sold moonshine in North Carolina, I think around the same time.
Oh, yeah.
And there are a lot of family stories and legends about that time, but it's a taboo topic, right? Because it was illegal. Then why were you bold? How were you bold enough to say, I want to tackle this? I want to put this on the page and depict black people in this time? Because we hear a lot about white folk, in Prohibition, and how a lot of people got rich from it.
Yes. I think that's part of the answer. I think so many of the Prohibition era stories that we see on TV and in books are really centered around white characters. So to be able to take a Prohibition story, as taboo a topic as it is, and put black folks at the center of it, just felt really exciting to me. And it's also a Prohibition era story set in an unusual location. I think we usually see Prohibition era stories in New York and Chicago, sometimes in the South where people are making moonshine and selling moonshine. But Runner's set in Martha's Vineyard, and it's set during a period where a lot of the black community there and everybody else who were fishermen, who were whalers, who had these boats, had the ability to take those ships and turn them basically towards crime, for lack of a better purpose. And that's the way people made their money. In a lot of ways, people survived the era. And it was also really nice to take that kind of taboo story and use it as a way into a community that people don't often hear too much about, both the early summer community in Martha's Vineyard and also the year-round black community who lived there really for hundreds of years, even before black folks started summering there.
Okay. And we're talking about relationships. When you think about relationships, though, on a bigger scale, more of a micro scale, in terms of community, in terms of class, like in Martha's Vineyard, there is the population of people, who summer there and have, their vacation homes there. But then there are people who live there year round who don't necessarily fall in the same tax bracket usually. Talk to us about writing about that dynamic and how people navigate that, because even within the black community, we know we're not a monolith.
Yes.
And there are differences in our relationships based on class.
Yeah, I think
There
the
can be.
opportunity, yes, yeah, to write across class lines is something that was important to me for Runner and for my first book, All We Were Promised, which is set in antebellum Philadelphia and also has characters who are kind of colliding with each other, you know, some from the upper class, some who are more working class. But to tell kind of a Martha's Vineyard story that's not just about the black elite, but is also about the working class folks who lived there in the 1920s and earlier and how they might have interacted with one another and, you know, maybe clashed in some ways and form relationships across those lines was just a really interesting space to explore. And the way that the story unfolds, the two protagonists, one is someone who is summering there, and she is part of one of these elite black families. She's from Boston. That's where a lot of the early summer families in Martha's Vineyard came from. And then the other main character is someone who lives there year round. So they're from two different places, two different classes. They interact with the island in completely different ways, but the two of them end up locked together basically on a crime spree, for the lack of a better term, after our main character, Lena, takes over her father's rum running operation when he disappears in a shipwreck. So you have this sort of upper class woman who can navigate all these clubs and, you know, the jazz and the cities in Boston and New York where they're going to sell their liquor. And then you have Lena, who, you know, she's the daughter of a fisherman. She's working class. And there's a lot of really interesting fascination between the two of them, admiration, curiosity, some envy that I think shows up in really interesting ways in these cross-class relationships. But part of it's also just education. You know, exactly like you said, the black community is not a monolith. There have been black elite for almost as long as black folks have been in this country, and there have been working class black folks as long as this country has been around. So just taking the time to introduce people to communities they might not otherwise have seen before, especially in historical fiction, is something that I love to do.
Thank you for doing that. You touched on the dynamic between the two main characters in Runner. One thing that I notice we don't talk about nearly enough is the beauty of same-sex women's relationships, right? Platonic relationships, that is. So there are hundreds of rom-coms about, like, you know, a breakup between a romantic partnership. There are so many songs about, you know, someone getting their heart broken, right? But we don't talk about what it's like to have your heart broken when you and your best friend of the same sex are no longer rocking with each other. Like, that's huge.
Yes.
So in talking about, you know, writing about relationships, how do you approach those types of relationships that aren't romantic? And we know romantic relationships are definitely important too, and we need to read about those and see ourselves seen in that way. But there's so many layers and there's so much depth to our sisterhoods
Yes.
that isn't necessarily explored as much in, you know, in literary fiction.
Yeah.
So yeah, talk about that, please.
Sure. I think I approach it with really deep reverence for the sisterhood that exists between two women or multiple women, especially because for so many of us, those relationships, platonic friendships, are the longest standing relationships that we have. My best friends from college, there's a little sisterhood group, there are about 7 of us. We've been together walking through life for 20 years at this point. I've known them longer than I've known my husband, and, you know, they'll be around for the rest of my life. So I think having stories that really capture what it means for somebody to walk through all of those different seasons of life with you, to grow up with you, to become mothers alongside you, to walk through a career with you, to experience, you know, getting married, breaking up, whatever it is. Those relationships, those sisterhoods are really what stick with us. Often more than anything else. So putting those at the center of my stories just felt very natural, I think. Both of my books, they have romances. They are not romances because, you know, they may or may not have a happy ending. I won't spoil it for you. But, you know, the romantic relationships are important, but I think that sisterhood and showing the ways that, as you said, it can be really heartbreaking when they break down and how that shows up in a story just can be really cathartic for readers to read about, just to recognize that those relationships matter just as much, if not more.
So you write about, well, you have thus far written about historical fiction, and you mentioned how much, you know, the research piece is important. How do you, like, prepare for writing a book? Do you just go into full on like um, I don't know, like breakout? I was gonna say encyclopedias. That's how old I am. But like, what do you sort of create these profiles for your characters? Like, kind of this is what she would like, this is what she doesn't like, or like tell us about that process for you.
Sure. So it starts with the historical research for me because before I can create a character, I kind of needed to know that such a person could have existed. So they're often inspired by historical figures. They're not necessarily biographical, but they might be inspired by someone who really exists. And that's a place where I can start to kind of build their world. What kind of rooms would they have walked through? What kinds of things would they have done with their spare time? What would they like? What kind of problems would they have faced? So that's kind of how I start building out the characters. So it's a lot of just research rabbit holes, which honestly is the most fun part for me. Sometimes even more than the writing, because writing can be really tough, but research is just reading. And I think a lot of us, before we're writers, we're readers. So getting a chance to just kind of sit and read historical facts and books and sometimes encyclopedias. I'm old as well, so I do reach for an encyclopedia when I can get one. So yeah, it starts with research, and then as I get to know the characters, I think I find I get to know them as I'm writing sometimes, because what I do notice is I'll come in with an idea. Okay, this character is going to do this in a given scene, and I get to it, and she does something else that feels more true to who the character actually is, and then I have to rework the story around whatever crazy choice she's done. In Runner, for example, our main character Lena, I think I started her off as a very reasonable person, but she's a young black woman walking through the criminal underworld, so she eventually makes some choices that are a little unhinged, a little bit poor, and I had to kind of rock with her through that. So letting the story unfold as I get to know the characters is also part of my process.
That's interesting. And I wouldn't necessarily think that, because I think when you're reading these books, right, you just assume that you have the story like from beginning to end already mapped out. But so many authors that I've talked to the past 2 days have said, no, the character let me know that this wasn't something that they would do, even though I had it in mind, so I had to pivot. That's really interesting. What is something that you learned from your two main characters in Runner about their relationship with each other, or otherwise, that surprised you and that you think would surprise us?
I think the two main characters in Runner, they are new to each other, but there's a relationship, a connection between their mothers that kind of colors the way that they ultimately see one another. And I think what's ultimately interesting about the two of them is this idea of multi-generational conflict, and sort of multi-generational forgiveness, and what it looks like to forgive someone who maybe hasn't personally done anything to you but may represent something that's really painful, and what that looks like and how you ultimately move past it. And it really starts with the two of them being honest with each other about who they are and what's important to them, and what matters, and the ways they do hurt each other over the course of the story. But yeah, I think that piece of sort of multi-generational kind of forgiveness and conflict was interesting and surprising for me as a writer.
Okay. And then for those of us who maybe are considering, writing, or maybe just want to write for fun, right, for pleasure, what advice would you give about incorporating authentic relationships, not just romantic relationships? 'Cause for some reason, when you say relationships, people automatically think romantic relationships, when, to your point, most of our first relationships are not romantic. But what advice would you give about weaving, real life-ish into those stories?
Sure. I think if you're thinking about writing fiction, thinking about what your day actually looks like, how much time are you spending with a romantic partner versus how much time you're spending, are you on the phone with your mom? Are you calling your dad? Are there coworkers that you have interesting relationships with? Are you texting back and forth with your best friend all day? Thinking about where the big moments of your life and the smaller moments of your life actually, who's showing up in those moments, and incorporating that into the story, I think can help the relationship show up in a really authentic way that actually reflects how much space non-romantic relationships take up in people's lives.
Okay. Well, we're about at time now. Okay, but Ashton has Runner available for pre-sale
Yes.
to our left, And then there are copies of your first book,
Yes, there are
physical copies
Yep,
here
yes.
that can be signed. Okay, so to our left in the book pavilion, please buy away. Thank you again for coming, okay, and joining us.
Thank you, Bridget.